Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Building a Software as a Service application with Rails. Today's episode is going to be a lot longer than the previous episodes. It's over 38 minutes long, and we're going to be implementing the subdomain logic, which is probably going to be the most difficult part of this application. Before we dive into that, though, I have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I want to thank Eric Skiff for the awesome intro music that you're hearing right now. You can go to ericskiff.com/music to get more of that. And I also want to say that I have been working on a site for my screencasts and blog posts. You can see it at the bottom there. It's appcasts.io. And if you want, you can head over there and become a subscriber. And all of my future videos and stuff like that you'll be able to find them on that website. So let's go ahead and get into this episode. We're going to start this episode out taking a look at what we're going to do in the browser. So in this episode, we're going to be working to create a new subdomain for every account and allow users to access their account on that particular subdomain. In order to work with subdomains, we have to lay a little bit of foundation here. Most people use the local host when they are developing, and as you probably know, you cannot use subdomains with this. So if I just type, a subdomain on there, it is not going to work. There's a couple different ways around this. There is the PAL server, which will set up a URL for development for you, and you can check that out. It's just POW, P-O-W. The other option is to use this website, lvh.me, and that just stands for local virtual host, and all that does is redirect back to your local host, essentially. So this is what I'm going to be using. It's pretty easy to use, but you'll require an internet connection for it. But when I put a subdomain on there, it works as expected. So let's think about how we want this thing to behave. As it stands now, the subdomain really doesn't do anything. And I can create an account. I can then visit the sign-in path, and I can sign in, and I'm allowed to do any of this regardless of what subdomain I'm on. So the ultimate workflow would be create an account. When the user creates an account, they should be after they create the account, they should be redirected to their particular subdomain where they can sign in. And then we want to take them to their actual application. Right now, when they sign in, it just takes them back to the welcome landing page. But we really want to take them to the inside of the application where they'll be able to track time. So we can consider what we just discussed a set of rules for how the application should behave. And what we can do is we can take those rules and put them into tests. And here we go. So before I get started here, I just wanted to have a few words about TDD here, test-driven development. So I did not start writing these features by writing the specs first. What I did was I did some exploration. It's usually called a TDD spike. So I did some exploration and tried a few different ways of solving the problems. And once I kind of had one in mind that I wanted to go with, what I did was I backed everything out and really sat down and thought about it, thought about all of the different rules that I needed to implement these features, and came back to the tests and wrote those out and then implemented the features as I went. So I feel if you start out testing, sometimes that can be a good thing if you know exactly what you're doing, if it's a problem you've solved before. But a lot of times I feel if I start with the tests, it limits my creativity. And this is different for everybody, so you can kind of just do whatever feels best to you. So that being said, we'll go ahead and start with the authentication feature. And what we want to do is make sure that in order for the user to sign in, they need to be on their specific subdomain, and that will allow them to sign into their specific account. So the first thing we're going to do is write a spec that specifically does not allow the user to sign in unless they're on a subdomain. And we'll just check this by raising a routing error. If you wanted to, you could redirect them, or something like that, display a message, but for now we'll just set up the routes such that it will raise an error. Now, because we're making this change, what we'll have to do is go back through the other specs in this file and update them such that the user is associated with an account and the user attempts to sign in on that account's subdomain. Because we are now specifying a subdomain option in our user sign-in macro, we'll need to modify that method to sign the user in on that particular subdomain. An important thing to note here is that when we specify the subdomain option, when we use a URL helper, we need to go to the new user session URL as opposed to the new user session path. The last thing we'll want to do in this file is remove the visit root path here in the sign out spec, because after a user signs in, they should be redirected such that the sign out button will be already visible. Next thing we'll want to do is in our spec helper, we'll want to tell Capybara to use no subdomain by default. So if you don't have a specific driver installed like WebKit for Capybara, I believe Capybara defaults to using the www subdomain. So we'll just change that with this line. Now if you are using WebKit or one of the other drivers, you'll want to do some additional research and see what works for you. So taking a look at our specs, we can see that in fact the routing error was not raised, so we'll have to take a look at our routes file. In our routes file, we're going to use a constraint such that we can only access the user sign-in page, and for that matter any of the other user pages if the user is on a subdomain. Rails 4 at least provides this out of the box, and all we need to do is define a class that defines a class level method called matches. That'll be given the request object, and from there we can check the subdomain, and if it's present we will allow the user to route to this location. Excellent, so all of our specs are passing. Now the next thing we want to think about is users can only sign in on a subdomain at this point, but let's write a spec to make sure that if two different users create two different accounts, they should not be able to log into each other's account on each other's subdomain. So the way we're going to write this spec is we are going to define a second user. Remember, in our let statement at the top, we define a first user and their account. So we'll define a second user. We'll have them sign into their specific account. Make sure that they can do that. And then we'll have them jump over to the first user's account, and they should not be able to sign into that. Taking a look back at our specs, we can see that this is failing. We expected the second login attempt to be unsuccessful, but looking at the text output, we can see that the user was in fact signed in successfully. So what we need to do is we need to separate the data for each account and make sure that the user, when a user visits a subdomain, only the users for that particular subdomain and account are being loaded. So other users from other accounts should not be able to sign into that account. So let me just illustrate this in the browser real quick just to make sure everybody's on the same page with me. So I'm visiting a subdomain, and at this point the subdomain is really arbitrary. And what I can do is sign in here, and I signed in successfully, and then I'll go ahead and sign out, and I'll visit a second subdomain. I'll have to visit the user sign in path, but on this subdomain I'll be able to sign in as well. And that's really not what we want to happen. We want the only subdomains that should be able to be visited are ones that accounts have been created for. So to handle this switching and creation of separate databases, we are going to use Postgres Schemas. So we are not really going to create separate databases, but we will segment the database for each account, and I'll give an example of that in a minute here. And we are going to use a gem called apartment. You can check that out on GitHub. You should read all the documentation. And so let's add that gem and let's try it out in the console. So in my gem file, I'm going to go ahead and add the apartment gem. And the next thing I'm going to do is create an apartment initializer file. In here, I'm going to just set up a configuration that will exclude the account model from being segmented into a schema. Like I said, I'm gonna show you what all this means in a second when we go into the console here. And this should be excluded models. And we'll run bundle exec Rails console to fire up the console here. So in here we can play with the apartment gem. So we'll use this apartment object. So as I said before, we are going to use Postgres Schemas to create pseudo databases for each user. So schemas are a Postgres only feature, and a database contains many schemas, and a schema can contain many tables. Now, the default schema is the public schema, and this is the one, if you've never worked with schemas before, this is the schema that you've been using all along. So what we can do is we can create a schema for each account, and inside that schema, after we've created the schema, we'll have to run all of our migrations to create all of our tables in there. And then when we go to a particular subdomain, we'll be able to switch to that schema, and from there we can access only the users and only the data for that particular account. So I think this is easier to see by example, so let's go ahead and try it out. So to illustrate this here, first we'll go ahead and create a user on the public schema. And because we want to use the public schema, we don't need to specify anything. It's just being used by default. So when we query the users, we get some results, and we can see that there were users in here previously, and that's okay. So let's try creating a schema now, and we'll use apartment for this, and we will use apartment database create. And as we can see here, apartment created the schema for us, and it also ran our migrations for us. So now our new schema is up to date and everything. Now we'll go ahead and switch to that schema with apartment. Now when we query for users, we should get nothing because we're on a brand new schema. And as you can see, we in fact do get nothing. So let's try creating an account with a user. Okay, so let's take a look at the SQL that this generated. Because we are on the My First schema, when we do our users query, we can just do that straight, insert into users. But because, if you remember in our initializer, we specified that the accounts table was to be excluded from our schemas, we are inserting into the public schema this new account. So now if we query our users here, we can see our new user that we just created, and if likewise if we query our accounts, we can see again that this is querying the public schema, and not only do we see the account we just created, but we see all of the accounts that we had here before. So hopefully this gives you a little idea about how the schemas are working. Like I said, the easy way to think about it is that a database has many schemas, and a schema has many tables within it. And apartment is just creating a schema for us and then running all of our migrations on it. And then from there we can insert users into there. If you want to learn more about this, I encourage you to check out the Postgres documentation, or you can read Ryan Biggs' book. Something like, the title is something like Multi-Tenancy with Rails. It's a great read, and you should check that out also. Now that we've got a bit of an understanding about how schemas work, we can start to play around with them in our application. Before we do this though, we should set up our spec helper so that our database is properly cleaned up after every spec run. Now apartment provides a database reset method that will reset your schema path back to public, and we should run that. And we should also create a macro that will drop all of our schemas for us, clear them out after each spec run. Now to write this macro, let's create a new file in the spec support directory, and we'll just call that macros.rb. Anything within the spec support directory is loaded automatically by rspec, by our rspec configuration at least. So in here I'm just going to dump a method that will drop our schemas for us. And I absolutely don't take credit for writing this method. I believe I got it out of Ryan Biggs' book, again, Multi-Tenancy with Rails, and if you want to know how this works, he gives an explanation of it in there. Next up, in the application controller, we'll want to have a before filter that switches to the appropriate schema based on the subdomain. So what we're doing here is we are first switching to the public schema. This should happen automatically, but I just like to be explicit about it. And after that, we will return there unless we have a subdomain. And if we do in fact proceed past that point, we'll switch to that subdomain. So now, revisiting our specs, we can see that we have a different error here. And the error is that one of the following schemas are invalid. So basically, we are not actually creating the schemas anywhere before we try to access them. So it's erroring out because we're trying to switch to a schema that does not exist. So first, since in our authentication feature we are using a factory to generate the account, we could just modify our factory to generate a schema for us properly after it's built. So we'll define a sub-factory, I guess you would call it, in here, called account with schema. So in here, basically, after the account is built, we will create a schema and switch to it. That way, when our owner is saved, it will be saved to the proper schema. And after the account is successfully created, we will reset our database back to the public schema so that it doesn't affect the rest of our spec. It looks like I have a little typo here. We want to use subdomain here, not schema. We want to create the schema based on the subdomain. Having created that new factory, we can now use it in our authentication feature spec. So with that, now all of our specs are passing again. But we want to be careful here because remember, we created schemas with the factory. So our actual application still never creates schemas by itself. We'll have to do that in the account controller. So let's move to our sign up spec, and let's add some tests in there to ensure that after you create an account, a subdomain and schema are in fact created for you. In our account creation feature spec, the first thing I want to do is pull out the account creation process into its own helper method, because we will be adding more specs to this and we will be reusing the same thing a couple times here. And what we can do here is run this sign up method before each spec, and we are going to use factory girl here to help us generate a unique subdomain every time this thing is run. So we'll have to make a slight modification to our accounts factory to allow for that. And back in the account creation feature spec, we want to make sure that after we've signed up, we can access our subdomain. First of all, we want to make sure that we are redirected to the subdomain and that there are no errors there. And we also want to ensure that we can access the subdomain for the account we've just created. Now, I can no longer check for the flash message because it actually will not work anymore, because we will be redirecting across a subdomain and our session is not persisted across subdomains. It's not shared across all of the subdomains. And the reason for that is you can actually do that with Rails. But the reason I'm not going to do that is because our subdomains represent different accounts, and you could be on different subdomains signed into different accounts, and they should not share any information like that. So our specs we have two failing specs now. Both are the ones that we just looked at. We can see that for one of them, we are trying to access an invalid schema because the schema has actually not been created. And the first one, we can see that the URL does not contain the subdomain because we are not redirecting to the subdomain after account creation. So both of these can be fixed up in the accounts controller. So here in the accounts controller, we'll want to modify the create action, and after an account is validated, we'll want to create a new schema, switch to that schema, save the account, and then redirect to the user's new subdomain. And because, like I said, the flash message won't be displayed, for now I'm just going to leave it off. We'll have some kind of workaround for this at a later time. So we will actually be redirecting the user to the sign-in page for their account on their new subdomain. Now all of our specs are passing, and the next thing we'd like to do is clean up the subdomain interaction a little bit. If a user visits a subdomain that is invalid, he should be redirected to the root of the application where he can create an account. Users should only be able to access content on a subdomain after they're authenticated to that particular subdomain. So let's take a look at this in the browser and see where we're at real quick. In the browser, and you'll want to restart your server if you haven't done that in a while. We can see that we can still create an account, and I'll go ahead and do that real quick. And when I create an account, I am redirected to my subdomain and I am asked to sign in. So let me try if I can sign in. And this seems like it works. So we still have a couple issues to iron out here. After I'm authenticated, we should show the user their actual site content, not this landing page. So we'll have to create a controller for our to represent our content for now, since we haven't actually developed the content. And if I try to visit a different subdomain, I actually see this error, and that's something we'd like to fix as well. We should probably just be redirected to the root path. So looks like we're getting there, and we need to just put some more polish on it. So to spec out some of these inconsistencies, I think we should create a subdomain feature spec in the spec features directory. So the first spec we'll write here will force us to redirect any invalid accounts back to the root path, and it will also make sure that we don't have any errors when we access a subdomain that doesn't have a valid schema. The next spec here just make sure that we can in fact visit subdomains that have valid accounts attached to them. And finally, we want to make sure that all of our content on our subdomain is password protected. So if we visit the root page, for example, of our subdomain, we want to be redirected to the sign-in page and see this must sign up or sign in or sign up before continuing message. So if you run the specs, you can see that they are indeed not passing. And to clean up the action of visiting an invalid subdomain, we're going to go back to the application controller, and we're going to add some logic in our load schema method to handle invalid requests and redirect them cleanly. Now one side thing I wanted to point out here is this where method, active record where method, can be replaced by find by in Rails 4, and that will eliminate the need to call first on this. That's just a little tip that I picked up recently, and it's quite nice. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that the user is authenticated before they access anything in their account. So Devise actually does this for us, and we can use a before filter and call this authenticate user. And what we'll have to do is we'll have to skip this this before filter on any controllers that where the user should not be authenticated or does not have to be authenticated. Now before I leave this file, the last thing I wanted to do is change Devise's default sign out path. to the so when the user signs in, they should be, or when the user signs out, they should be redirected to their sign-in page for their domain. A run of our specs shows that the specs that we just added are passing, but as I said before, since we added the authenticate user method to the application controller, we'll need to skip that for anything that doesn't require the user to be signed in. So taking a look at my welcome controller, I'm just going to skip this before filter, and we'll have to do something similar in the accounts controller. Now what you want to do is make sure you specify this only. Instead of skipping it for everything, make sure you specify exactly which actions you want to skip it for, because if you come in here later and add a new action that does need to be authenticated, you want to make sure that that's working and you don't bypass that unknowingly. So now we're getting close to the end here, and I want to add just a couple more specs to round out the functionality. I want to make sure that we cannot create an account while we're on a subdomain, because that doesn't make any sense. So we'll add a spec for that. In this spec, we're going to grab the user and the subdomain that is created in the before sign up here. We're going to sign them in, and in order to use this sign user in macro, we'll have to move it to our support macros file. We'll do that in a second. And once the user signed in, we should expect that if they visit the new account URL, they'll get a routing error because they should not be able to create an account at that time. The last spec here is going to be, it's probably not necessary, but I ran into an edge case with it, so I'm going to add it. And that is allowing a follow-up account creation. Now let me explain. If somebody comes to the site and creates an account, and they use an email for their account, because that user record with that email is being created in their specific schema, somebody should be able to come along right after them and sign up with the same email address. Like I said, just because the user record should be totally separated from the public schema and from each other. So there should be no way to validate that against all of the other user records, and you really don't want to. So hopefully that makes sense, and we'll add that spec in now. So essentially we'll create a second subdomain, and we'll sign up for an account with that second subdomain, and we'll expect, just like in our allows user to create account spec, we'll expect to be redirected to a URL that contains our second subdomain. And now since our first account is being created in the before, we should expect our account records, we should expect to have 2 of them. Next up, since we are using this sign user in macro in multiple spec files now, it's probably good to move that into the macros file that we created earlier. And you know, these are really unrelated macros, but I'm okay leaving them like this for now because there's only 2 of them, and we really don't know what our needs will be in the future, so we don't really know what other macros are going to come around, so I think it's kind of premature to separate this into different support files. So we'll leave it like this for now. What we want to do is make sure that accounts can only be created if the user is not on a subdomain. And we can do that in a similar way that we did before, and we'll create a new class called subdomain blank, and we'll define this matches method, and then we can have a constraint where we only allow certain routes when there is no subdomain. And our welcome page should really only be seen if the subdomain is blank as well. So when a user is on their subdomain and logged in, we should really show them a different route path. And the route path when they're logged in should be the actual business logic of our application. So their projects that they are tracking time for example. So what we can do is just add a quick page that doesn't do anything but just serves as a placeholder that we can expand on next time. And the users, once they log in, they'll be redirected here, and that's where they'll be able to track time. So let's add that route in here now. And as of Rails 4, in order to have two routes specified, you'll have to rename one, and we'll just rename this one to subdomain route. Really, that doesn't have any consequences that we need to be concerned about right now. So we'll just put that in. And I want to put the question mark in here for the matches method. And we also want to specify, to cut down on our number of routes, we can specify for our accounts resources that we only want to generate the new and create routes for now. So looking at our specs, we can see that since we made that tweak and added the projects as our root route, we'll need to create a projects controller that has no logic for now, and we'll need to create a projects index view. We'll want to go ahead and create a projects controller. And I just pasted something in here. Just an index action is all we need for now. And I'll want to create a projects index template, and so you'll need to create a new views folder for projects, and just paste in something quick there as a placeholder. Back in our console, we can see that all of our specs are indeed passing now. Let's take a final look at this thing in the browser. If I visit the site with no subdomain, I'm asked to create an account. And if I visit my account subdomain, if you'll remember, I created this earlier. I'm showing this projects page. Hello, you can now track time. So next time, we can work to build out the actual functionality of the application. If I visit an incorrect subdomain, I'm taken back to the root path where I can create an account. I could sign out here, and when I sign back, I'm just sent back to my sign-in page, my particular subdomain. And so everything looks like it's working well here, and thanks for watching.